Axel Honneth's resolve in striving to renew the basic ideas of socialism is a boon to anyone seeking a way out of the political misery currently afflicting Western countries. For at present there, right-wing populism is effectively the only counter-movement to the decades-long dominance of neoliberalism. And both of these ideologies undermine the normative fundament of the Western post-war order. Neoliberalism, through the alliance between the political elites and the interests of capital at the expense of social justice, that's Kraut's topic of post-democracy, and right-wing populism, whose rise is due precisely to the aforementioned alliance through a regression to a long-vanquished nationalism with racist features. In this situation, where the political alternatives in the West seem reduced to a choice between plague and cholera, either more of the same with neoliberalism or the iron fist of right-wing populism, Honneth's work has the significant merit of advocating anew for the socialist system as the alternative to the presently dominant capitalism. Honneth wants to free socialism from its founding fathers' theoretical narrowness and mistakes in order to reveal its contemporary emancipatory potential. There are good grounds for this endeavor, but in my view, the shortcomings of the major socialist theorists do not compel us to place socialism in a new social theoretical framework as Honneth set out to do. He thinks that today socialism can only be revived in a post-Marxist form. However, I will argue the following, that the program of reconstructing historical materialism Jürgen Habermas has pursued up to the mid-1970s still provides a fruitful theoretical framework for the transformation of capitalist societies sought by socialism. I want to show that Honneth's objections to the legacy of socialism only compel a correction of this framework, but not its abandonment. Honneth attributes three interconnected, and he claims problematic background assumptions to the founding fathers of socialism. Now, the first one, according to Honneth, for all protagonists of the socialist movement, the economic sphere is a central locus of struggle over the appropriate form of freedom. In Honneth's view, Marxism conceives society as an entity determined entirely by the economic sphere. This economic monism loses sight, according to Honneth, of the functional differentiation of modern societies, that is, the independence of social spheres of action, which, according to Max Weber, have a key role in contemporary rationalization processes. Honneth claims that for Marxism, the task of social integration and socialism could be left up entirely to the unified will of cooperative producers, such that it would no longer be necessary to democratically negotiate social aims in the political sphere. The second assumption of the founding generation of socialists, Honneth maintains, is that their doctrine was the mouthpiece, or more specifically, the reflection of an oppositional force already present in society, which means that the relation of theory to praxis, quote Honneth, consists in educating, informing, or enlightening a clearly defined social group, end of quote, the proletariat. And Marx reinforced early socialism's, again quote Honneth, tendency to draw self-referential conclusions by projecting onto social reality a collective movement which was meant to justify its own prognosis, end of quote. This ascribes social theory the theoretically dubious role of being an expression or reflection of the consciousness of the working class. And the third background assumption, according to Honneth, the founding fathers of socialism thought that the changes they sought to make in social relations are historically necessary to a certain degree. The conviction that the economic sphere has a deterministic priority went hand in hand with a historical philosophical determinism. The founding generation of socialism, on Honneth's view, thereby understand social progress as the result of objective insights into the law of history, not as practical exploration of situationally dependent possibilities for specific changes. According to Honneth, this meant, quote, the divide between socialism and an experimental understanding of historical action was categorical and not gradual. Due to socialists' belief in the inevitable course of history, they were certain right from the start about the next step of social change, obviating any need for situational experimentation with various possibilities of social organization. End of quote. Honneth advocates reformulating socialism as a historical experimentalism. Honneth is thinking of the institutional implementing of social freedom within the economy as devised and overseen by a democratic public sphere. Honneth reproaches Marxism, rightly in my opinion, for underestimating the importance of democratic politics in establishing and shaping a socialist society. However, Honneth's three aforementioned charges, namely that Marxism advocates an economic monism as well as a historical determinism, and thereby sees its own theoretical claims as mirroring or reflecting social reality, are, in my mind, too simplistic. All three of Honneth's charges are based on the thesis that Marx and Engels understood their basic superstructure theorem in a reductive fashion such that the economic sphere is seen as determining the entire structure of society, and such that the conflict between the productive powers and the productive relations in the previous forms of society always causes the transition to new forms of society. Although Marx and Engels often presented their base superstructure theorem in this reductionist fashion, the construction of their theories is more differentiated and complex. And Honneth himself qualifies all three of his objections. The first one, he mitigates his first objection, namely that because of his economic monism, Marx had neglected the functional differentiation of modern society by way of reference to Marx's earlier text on the Jewish question. Marx there views the capitalist market economy and the state as being two separate spheres, each of which is subject to a different set of principles. Second point, when in the idea of socialism, Honneth charges Marx's systematic writings with a self-referential theoretical closure, he excludes Marx's historical and political writings from this. He refers in this context to his contribution to the anthology of the conference proceedings nach Marx in German, edited by Rachel Jägi and Daniel Leuk, where he had interpreted the different perspectives in Marx's critique of political economy and in his historical political writings as follows. Now quote Honneth from this article. For in his, it is Marx's description of the class struggle in his historical studies, he assumes that the course of the direction of historical processes can constantly change, initiated in each case by the fact that collective actors can give a normative reorientation to institutional reality. In Capital, he denies precisely the possibility of such a change of direction because the capitalist development is supposed to pursue only the path of a social expansion. End of quote. Honneth thus concedes that Marx allowed for the normative sphere having an autonomous role in social evolution, and not only on the Jewish question, but also in later writings. The third aspect. In the idea of socialism, Honneth cites the objection that the representatives of critical theory had made to the notion that Marx advocated historical philosophical determinisms. Those representatives of critical theory interpret Marx as saying that historical progress is only inevitable as long as the social relations of production are reproduced in a natural way, removed from the rational control of humans. Honneth does not take an unambiguous position on this reading of the Marxist basis superstructure theorem. He first points out that Marx's rapidly popularized conception of history has a deterministic character, thus opening up the interpretative possibility that Marx's original theory is not deterministic. However, Honneth seems to rule out this interpretative possibility on the following page by speaking of the confusion caused by the historical philosophical determinism of socialist pioneers. Despite his partial mitigation of his three objections to traditional Marxism, Honneth claims they strike at the core of Marx's systematic writings. They are supported by a passage in Capital where Marx agrees with the following claim by Reduer. That's from the foreword to the second edition of Capital. Quote Marx. Marx quote the reviewer, who says, Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness and intelligence, but rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness and intelligence. End of quote. Drawing on the so-called New Marx reading initiated in Horkheims and Adorno's circle by Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt, Georg Lohmann has pointed out that Marx's Capital does not seamlessly fit with the theoretical framework of historical materialism. Engels coined the name historical materialism to refer to the positions that he and Marx developed together in their early writings. Habermas derives the basic assumption of historical materialisms from the work they co-authored, the German Ideology. My thesis that Honneth's objections to Marxism only compel correcting but not abandoning historical materialism is based on Lohmann's separation of historical materialism from Marx's Capital. Through recourse to Habermas' reconstruction of historical materialism, I first want to argue that the original form of the historical materialist approach in Marx and Engels' early writings can be understood as a historical experimentalism in the sense in which Honneth uses the term, namely as a practical exploration of situationally dependent possibilities for specific changes. Marx and Engels' experimentalism is, however, conceived as an elite project, and it thus takes insufficient account of democratic consensus building. By drawing on the later Engels' comments about the bourgeois state, I then try to show that historical materialism can account for the functional differentiation of modern society. The fact that Engels, like Marx, did not develop a conception of democratic consensus building is an omission that can be corrected within the theoretical framework of historical materialism. In the correspondence of 1843 with Ruge, Bakunin, and Feuerbach, the young Marx characterizes the critical philosophy that Engels would later call historical materialism as the self-understanding, in German Selbstverständigung, to be gained by the present time of its struggles and desires. The analysis of current social conflicts is supposed to indicate how far the desire for a change in existing conditions can in fact be realized. Marx thereby rejects any theoretical construct of the future, that's a quotation from Marx, and thus also rejects historical determinism. This fits with Engels' position. He stresses in his article, The Kommunisten Karl-Heinzen, published in 1847, that the critical philosophy he and Marx had conceived is not a doctrine, but, quote Engels, the theoretical summation of the conditions for the liberation of the proletariat, end of quote. This anticipates Horkheimer and Adorno's concept of the real possibilities of the present historical situation. Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, which Engels called the brilliant germ of historical materialism, gave a pithy formulation of its conception of knowledge. Now, quote a thesis on Feuerbach. The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, it is the reality and power in practice, of his thought in practice. End of quote. Marx here takes up Francis Bacon's dictum that human science, human knowledge, scientia, human knowledge, science, and human power, potentia in Latin, are coincident. The theoretical assumptions that historical materialism makes must thus be tested using its prognosis of the prospects for success of attempts at social change. And this forms the counterpart to a scientific experiment. Habermas reconstructs the self-reflexive structure of historical materialism, which is conceived a unity of theory and praxis, with the help of his distinction between a system-functional observer's perspective and the participant's perspective, which takes its bearings from normative claims. It is in this way that Habermas can develop a non-reductionist reading of the basic superstructure theorem that recognizes that the normative sphere has relative autonomy in social evolution. The Marxist theoretical program focuses, according to Habermas, on the explanation of fundamental social crises with the expectation that the critique of the existing conditions will fall on fertile ground in precisely such situations. Historical materialism investigates the genesis of systematic social crisis from the observer's perspective, based on the hypothesis that the present forms of society are in a systematic crisis. From the participant's perspective, the historical evolution of social codes of norms is interpreted as a progressive approximation to the normative standards found in historical materialism's social critique. Both perspectives are self-reflexively intertwined. Historical materialism seeks evidence that the social change it wants to bring about does actually provide a way out of the systematic crisis it diagnoses. In the event that the attempt at change succeeds, the protagonist's action, which must by themselves be conceived as the expression of their conscious decisions and capable of a normative justification, are explicable in system-functional terms from the observer's perspective. From the observer's perspective, Historical materialism traces the susceptibility of all forms of society to systematic crisis back to the conflicting economic interests that originate from the differentiation in the division of labor. These antagonisms emerge openly in the market economy. They can remain somewhat disguised in traditional society, where social norms deter individuals from the consistent pursuit of their economic interests. In the market economy, the producers of goods and service providers strive for the largest possible profit margins, while consumers seek the lowest prices. Wage earners try to increase their income, businesses try to keep personal costs low. Wage earners compete for jobs, producers and suppliers for sales opportunities. These conflicting interests can remain latent in societies where generally accepted social norms regulate work processes and exchange of goods, for instance in the Indian caste system or in the feudalism of medieval Europe. The role of the state authorities in maintaining social class structures shows that economic antagonisms are virulent in all highly developed societies, at least below the surface. There is a clear potential of escalation in economically motivated conflicts, as can be seen throughout history, when societies face the trials and ordeals occasioned by the rebellions of disadvantaged strata or power struggles between well-off strata. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels emphasize that the state can only fulfill its systematic function of curbing the particular interests of social groups or strata when it both presents itself as the advocate of general interests and also holds true to this self-description to some extent. In all previous state forms, however, the codes of norms that reinforce economic inequality were legally secured. This justifies the assumption that the normative regulation of the economy prescribed by the state has always also served to prevent the underprivileged from perceiving and safeguarding their economic interests. The understanding of the state as a superstructure of the economic base in the German ideology thus implies that its systematic function is to contain social conflicts. As historical hindsight reveals, underlying such conflicts are economic interests, albeit often in concealed form. From the participants' perspective, historical materialism, that, to quote Marx, the stages in the development of the human mind, end of quote, are manifest in the world historical evolution of the state's legal system. This leads to a really human morality, as Engels puts it. This means the law is Janus-faced. On the one hand, in all previous forms of society, the law buttressed socioeconomic privileges. On the other hand, we can detect normative progress over the course of legal history. Marx and Engels were convinced that the gap between the rich and the poor in capitalism would sooner or later become so acute that the disadvantaged would find the existing conditions unbearable. Marx and Engels call for the socialist comrades in arms to awaken a communist consciousness among the underprivileged in the face of systematic crisis of capitalism. This can be done by showing them clearly how the bourgeois state realizes its fundamental principle of freedom and equality only in an abstract legal sense, that is, in a way that does not provide the least redress for the socio-economic powerlessness of the participants. Since Marx and Engels reject any doctrine-based construction of the future, their affirmation that the victory of the proletariat is inevitable in the Communist Manifesto must be seen as political rhetoric. Their claim that the existing social order will collapse if, in the systematic crisis of capitalism, the intellectual avant-garde succeeds in creating a communist consciousness through rhetorical manipulative means, is a hypothesis about historical possibilities for action. This hypothesis can be verified or falsified through the success or failure of the avant-garde's attempts at change. The original form of historical materialism is thus an experimentalism, and it is conceived of as an elite project. Most of the central socioeconomic decisions in socialist states were taken following this line of thinking. For example, the new economic policy at the beginning of the 1920s in the Soviet Union, the compulsory collectivization of agriculture and the forced industrialization under Stalin, the great leap forward under Mao Zedong in China, and Deng Xiaoping's social market economy were experiments initiated by political elites. In the next part of my lecture, I want to discuss the later Engels' recognition of the key role of modern democratization processes for a future socialism. He rejects a reductionist reading of the basic superstructure theorem by pointing to the co-evolution of the capitalist economy and the bourgeois states. Engels attributes a trend of its own to the bourgeois state's new political power. Although it is bound to economic developments, the state also can impact the conditions and course of production because of its relative independence. These are quotations from a letter of Engels to Konrad Schmidt. In Anti-Düring and in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels adheres to the thesis of the German ideology that the state can only fulfill its systematic superstructure function of damming up the social conflicts that ultimately spring from the division of labor by forming an at least partial counterpole to the antagonistic sphere of the economy. The ambivalent role of the state in the German ideology, which must present itself as being the advocate of the general interests of society, but also reinforces class interests, is conceived by the later Engels as a functional difference between its social service or administration and political rule. The former, the administration, must keep the general affairs of society in view, while in contrast, the latter always consolidates socioeconomic class positions. According to Engels, the normative progress of bourgeois law is due to the specific requirements of the state's role in maintaining order, a role that arose from the modern erosion of traditional norms in the free market economy. In early capitalism, which Engels analyzes in the Nachlass text on the decline of feudalism and the Germans of national states, and in Anti-Düring, the interests of the bourgeois factory owners and the merchants who spur on the economic upswing collide with those of the feudal lords who use tariffs to impede long-distance trade, and those of the traditional artisans who use their guild system to regulate the labor market. The emerging bourgeoisie wins the upper hand with the help of the then developing territorial or national states. This is explicable in system functional terms. The dismantling of feudal privileges and tariffs was economically efficient. The centralization of state power dammed up the conflicts between local feudal lords that had dominated the Middle Ages. Engels recognizes the new profession of bourgeois jurists as having a key anti-feudal role in constructing the central state administration. He emphasizes that the bourgeois capitalist form of society could only be achieved through the confiscation of feudal property. This anticipates Weber's more detailed analysis. He writes in Politics as a Vocation of how the modern state was constituted as an institutional form of rule through the expropriation of local feudal agents of administrative power. With the help of legal specialist knowledge, the nascent market economy makes available the means for the establishment of the central administrative state at the expense of feudal property and the privileges of the estates. From the participant's perspective of historical materialism, which takes its bearings from normative claims, the dismantling of these privileges is to be regarded as normative progress. The bourgeois state can present itself as a power that stands above socio-economic interests and class oppositions because it grants, at least formally, the right to freedom of movement and to a free choice of professions and so on to all its members. With the global expansion of the market economy, liberal capitalism, which happened in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, economic actors' leeway for action moved into the background in the face of the money-driven mechanism of the process of capitalist production. Engels argues in The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, that the highest form of the state, the democratic republic, is under our modern conditions of society more and more becoming an inevitable necessity. How does this fit with Marx and Engels' fundamental conviction that bourgeois law, by guaranteeing private ownership of the means of production, cements the socio-economic power imbalance between business management and wage earners? Habermas points out that the concept of necessity in historical materialism signifies both a causal or system functional determination and an ethical demand. If we read Engels' argument as bringing together both of these senses, it can be related to the concept of knowledge as self-understanding that is specific to historical materialism, namely as an explanation of the conditions for the liberation of the proletariat. Thus understood, Engels' thesis suggests that the bourgeois state can only safeguard its systematically indispensable function of maintaining order under the conditions of an increasingly anonymous capitalist economy through democratization processes. These processes, however, are inevitably rudimentary, so long as private ownership of the means of production remains, and they thus have an illusory character. This also means that the fundamental systematic crisis of capitalism, predicted by Marx and Engels, creates an unavoidable choice between either forfeiting all the achievements of democratization or advancing consistently with them by socializing the means of production. Engels writes in Anti-Düring that, quote, "The modern state is the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists." End of quote. The obstruction of free competition through monopolies and cartels or attempts to illegally influence politicians and the authorities, especially through corruption, in order to maximize business profits, are paradigmatic examples of capitalist attacks on the framework of sustainable market economy. The Luddite struggle against technical innovation, which Marx and Engels considered myopic, is an example of a workers' attack on this freedom. The state must counter such violent acts as well as owners' attempts to withhold their income. The state needs this revenue to finance infrastructure, public education, and so on, as without these there would be a risk of social anarchy or economic collapse. It must enforce the general systematic interests of capitalist production against resistant particular interests. Bourgeois law forms the normative framework of the capitalist market economy. Engels characterizes it as an independent field that, quote, for all its general dependence on production and trade, is nevertheless capable of reacting in its own way to those spheres, end of quote. The disappearance of traditional social norms in modernity increases the demands for a rational foundation for and an internal coherence in state action. The law must not, Engels claims, by reason of internal contradictions, give itself a lie. The government administration that is beholden to, in Engels' words, the general affairs of bourgeois capitalist societies must do right by both the interests of the capitalist system and the demand for normative coherence. This is why the administration must be open to those who have gained sufficient expertise to deal with this task. State bureaucracy is thereby incorporated into the labor market, in which everyone can, in principle, participate. The bourgeois state's tendency towards democratization results both from the need for qualified specialist officials and also from the normative framework of bourgeois law itself, which recognizes everyone's right to life and, even in a very rudimentary way, a leeway for self-determination, at least on a formal level. The bourgeois state's tendency towards democratization remains lacking, however. It defends the systematic interests of the capitalist economy, which is characterized by a power imbalance between the owners of capital and wage earners. Precisely because of the demand for specialist qualifications, entry into the state administration is ultimately only open to the privileged citizenry. As long as wage earners profit economically from the prosperity created by the market economy, the class character of the bourgeois state can remain concealed. According to Marx and Engels, it openly emerges when the limits of growth are finally reached. In Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels predicts that in the event that market economy is threatened with dysfunctionality, the state would have to take over the productive forces, whereby it would act as essentially a capitalist machine. Quote Engels, "The capitalist relation is brought to a head and topples over." End of quote. Engels' prediction of the fundamental systematic crisis in bourgeois capitalist society has been confirmed by the government bailouts at the taxpayers' expense of the banks in the 2008 financial crisis, the austerity programs pushed through by the leaders of the European Union and the executive committees to counterfinance them, the progressive shift of fundamental economic and political decisions over to central banks that are frequently run by foreign investment bankers, all of which has in turn provoked the rise of a right-wing populism that wants to go back to a pre-capitalist paternalism and thus overtly and covertly attacks democracy. However, we find not the least indication in capitalist countries of a dialectical turnaround into socialism. Whoever remains committed to this political goal will find in Engels' work a signpost for the direction that the transformation of bourgeois capitalist society into a socialist society must take. Engels claims that in socialism, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things. The administration moves into the center, he maintains, allowing political rule to dissolve. The dialectical turnaround of capitalism to socialism, which Engels regards as a real possibility in the fundamental systematic crisis of capitalism, is based on a continuity between the two forms of society. The administration, which promoted the general interests of the bourgeois capitalist society, now has to secure the framework of the socialist economy. Honneth argues in The Idea of Socialism that Marxism neglected to consider the possibility of institutionalizing social freedom in the economic sphere beyond a centralized planned economy. But he points out that according to the original intuition of its founding generation, under socialism, the producers are supposed to maintain a horizontal cooperation and mutual supplementation in their relations to each another. In their early writings, Marx and Engels appropriated this intuition concerning cooperative production. Honneth's charge that the founding fathers of socialism downplay the problem of democratic control of the administration in socialism is undoubtedly valid. However, in my view, a theory of democratic consensus building can be integrated into the Marxist project of a socialist society. Engels' claim that all officials are responsible for all the official actions to every citizen is evidence of this. The bridging function between the bourgeois capitalist and the socialist society that Engels attributes to the state administration accords with Honneth's demand that socialism today must, quote, no longer think of the social collective, but of institutional achievements as a true embodiment that demands of socialism. End of quote. However, Honneth regards the democratization tendency of the bourgeois administration with a more skeptical eye than Engels, and he emphasizes the key democratic role of the public sphere, which Marxism does not consider. Honneth takes the Marxist idea of the historical possibility of a dialectical turnaround of capitalism, of a capitalism that has reached the limits of growth into socialism, to be obsolete. He thinks it is unrealistic to describe an imminent tendency to bring about its own demise to capitalism. Socialism should instead work, to quote Honneth, to make modern society more social in the full sense of the term by unleashing forces or potentials already contained in the current society. End of quote. Unlike, for instance, Wolfgang Streeck, Honneth evidently does not consider the enduring crisis of a capitalism that has struck the political system in Western countries with the rise of right-wing populism to be the beginning of the end of capitalism. The viability of the capitalist system cannot be reliably assessed at this time. Honneth's reservations about the central Marxist prognosis that capitalist system will destroy itself has, in my opinion, not only empirical but also theoretical architectonic grounds. Honneth's monograph, Freedom's Right, The Social Foundations of Democratic Life, where he seeks to renew Hegel's philosophy of right, forms the theoretical framework for the idea of socialism. The distinction between a system functional observer's perspective and a participant's perspective oriented toward theoretical validity that Habermas had used in reconstructing historical materialism cannot be applied within this architectonic of Honneth. If I understand it correctly, this distinction also does not play a role in Honneth's freedom's right, the social foundations of democratic life, despite its reference to Torquato Parsons, and nor does it so in the idea of socialism. The triad of negative, reflexive, and social freedom that Honneth wants to use to normatively reconstruct modern democratic ethical life in German Sittlichkeit belongs to the participant's perspective. The same holds of his presentation of the socialist idea of an association of free producers. There, quote Honneth, the members would realize their shared aims by intentionally producing for each other on the basis of their mutual recognition of each other's needs, thus performing their own individual actions for the sake of these needs. End of quote. The architectonic of historical materialism, reconstructed by Habermas, is a self-reflexive intertwining of the observer and the participant's perspective, and that is only applicable to contemporary capitalism when it gets into a final systematic crisis. For only in this case can the transition to a socialist society, which those involved must conceive as their free undertaking, from a participant's perspective, be explained also in system functional terms from the observer's perspective. The truth claim of historical materialism thus stands and falls with the prognosis of the self-destruction of capitalism. Only when this looms can historical materialism be verified by testing the historical possibility of the transition to socialism. In this case, it becomes, to use Marx formulations in his Grundrisse, true in practice. In the last part of my lecture, I will outline Honneth's view of a step-by-step transformation of the capitalist economy into democratic socialism and relate it to Marx and Engels' account of socialism and communism. Honneth considers it a crucial flaw of Marx's theory that it conceives of communism as a categorical counter-image to the market economy. According to Marx and Engels, the exchange of goods on the market will disappear in advanced socialist societies approaching communism. Engels writes in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific that the advanced socialist economy will be directed by a plan drawn up by public administration under democratic control. In his critique of the Gotha program, Marx described a higher phase of common society in the following well-known passage. End of quote. Quote. The enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished. Labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. The productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. This passage reminds of Marx and Engels' utopian sketch of common society in the German ideology. Quote, "Nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic." End of quote. Honneth objects to this utopian design of a common society that, quote, "it not only severely underestimates the amount of effort and knowledge acquisition required for a vast range of specialized jobs, but also betrays an astonishing tendency to ignore the ongoing persistence of manual, arduous, and degrading work. However, Honneth integrates the goal of an egalitarian restructuring of the social division of labor, from which Marx and Engels' utopian design of the communist society arises, into his own conception of socialism. The link between Honneth's program of a step-by-step transformation of the capitalist economy into a democratic socialism and Marx and Engels is a passage in the Communist Manifesto where they grant place to market relations in an early phase of socialism. According to the Communist Manifesto, the decisive step on the path from capitalism to socialism is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, the increase of national factories, the expropriation of large land holdings, and a strong progressive taxation that skims off the funds for public investments from the prosperous. This conception of a proto-socialism, as it could be called, in which market economic segments are integrated into a socialist framework, forms the point of connection in Marx's theory for the new economic policy in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and for Mikhail Gorbachev's economic reforms as well as those of Deng Xiaoping. The crucial thesis of Honneth's conception of a democratic socialism is that the quality of democratic participation and thereby the function of political decision-making depends essentially on the economic presupposition of a fair, transparent, and maximally inclusive division of labor within a society. The slimmer the opportunities for having a say in the shape assumed by one's own labor, the lower one's primary income, and the worse the reputation of the work in question, the weaker the individual's faith in her own political efficacy. Honneth points out that this contention is in accordance with Marx and Engels' account of socialism and communism. For Marx and Engels, one thing is certain: liberation from economic exploitation and political oppression go hand in hand. According to Honneth, however, Marx and Engels did not realize that market relations may be an integral part of socialist society without damaging its emancipatory character. The core of a socialist economy in Honneth's sense are cooperative enterprises run by the employees. As these cooperative enterprises already exist in capitalism, they play a central role in Honneth's program of a step-by-step transformation of capitalism into a democratic socialism. Quote Honneth from his most recent book, The Working Sovereign. In my view, there is no doubt that the gradual transformation of private and state enterprises into autonomously managed production cooperatives would be an ideal means of realizing a working world compatible with democracy. End of quote. The cooperative enterprises in contemporary capitalism, however, due to their egalitarian goals, run the risk of losing out in the competition on the free market with private sector companies, which relocate jobs to low-wage countries and often have no moral qualms about overt exploitation. As Honneth points out, cooperative enterprises under capitalism therefore require decisive state support if they are not to go bankrupt or abandon their egalitarian goals. A fascinating trait of Honneth's conception of a gradual transition from capitalism to socialism is as clear for mandatory public service, either for a specific age cohort or all adult members of a society. The fields of work Honneth has in mind comprise raising children, caring for the elderly and sick, or perhaps even disposing of waste. Honneth justifies his plea for a mandatory social service with the argument that it promotes the understanding of those persons who until now worked in these areas without getting due respect from society. Honneth's plea for a mandatory social service is his adaptation of Marx and Engels' claim in the German ideology that in communism nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity. Honneth's conception of a gradual transformation of capitalism to socialism is a roadmap whose various aspects require further clarification. In my eyes, however, this roadmap shows the right way out of capitalism. Thank you.